Welcome to Towson University, alumni, students, faculty, staff, and friends. I'm Jenna Mills, the Director of Alumni Engagement Programs and a proud 2009 and 2016 graduate of Towson University. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion on Civil Rights in Maryland, Part 1. We're very excited about today's event, which is co-sponsored by the Towson University Retired Faculty Association and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. Joining me today from the Towson Alumni Relations team to help with this presentation is Steve Rosenfeld, Director of Alumni Communication and Recognition. I'd like to thank Tracy Miller and Tracy Jacobs for collaborating with us and making this event possible. Osher offers adults age 50 and older opportunities for continued learning, along with programs and activities for social and cultural enrichment in a congenial and supportive environment. I'd now like to introduce Ron Matlin, President of the TU Retired Faculty Association, to share a few remarks. Ron.
Greetings, everybody. Well, what is TURFA, Towson University Retired Faculty Association? We're a group that got organized about 5 years ago, and right now we have a little over 100 members who are retired faculty, librarians, and supporters of what we do. And we have two main goals. The first goal is that we maintain ties with Towson University and serve the institution as volunteers in a number of ways. And the second goal is that we promote our own common interests and serve our fellow retirees also in a variety of ways. So we're serving both the university and we're serving the retired faculty and librarians. What is happening today is one of the many ways in which we do serve our audience. And I'd like to thank Osher, and I'd like to thank the Alumni Association at Towson for co-sponsoring this event with us. And a special thanks, already noted, but a special thanks from me representing TURFA, both Tracy Miller and Tracy Jacobs, who really put this whole program together. And finally, thanks to the two presenters you're going to hear from in just a moment, and let me turn it over to them. Thank you.
Okay, so before I introduce today's panelists, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes, of course. The session today is recorded and will be shared with all event registrants when it is finalized. Attendees will remain muted throughout the discussion, but if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Please use the chat function in your window and direct your question to all panelists. We will monitor the questions throughout the session, and our panelists can answer the questions at the end of the presentation. Questions, of course, will remain anonymous today. I'd now like to introduce our panelists, C. Fraser Smith. Fraser is a retired columnist and editorial writer for the Baltimore Sun, and he served as a political analyst for Baltimore's national public radio station, WYPR. He is the recipient of numerous journalism awards and author of Here Lies Jim Crow, Civil Rights in Maryland. Joining for him from our discussion today is Dr. Donn Worgs. Donn is a TU professor in the Department of Political Science. His areas of study include American politics, urban politics, African American studies and politics, and community development. He has authored numerous articles for publication, as well as papers, reports, and presentations. Donn and Fraser, thank you so much for being here today. And to start, can you both briefly explain how you became involved in studying or reporting on civil rights movements?
Okay, for me, the civil rights movement has always been just fascinating, and I think it kind of reflects, a lot of what we uphold as our kind of democratic values, and it also reflects just individual and group heroism. Folks who are heroic, folks who are committed to a vision of improving the world. And so I've always been attracted to that history and intrigued by it. And so the more I've had an opportunity to, I've tried to learn as much as I could. I just think it's a fascinating topic to learn about, and it also tells us a lot about American democracy. I think in many ways, it's maybe one of the most effective ways of understanding America's democracy and the evolution of American democracy.
I got interested in it in various different ways. One of them was when I was working on a biography of William Donald Schaefer. I spent a fair bit of time at the Maryland Historical Society, and I ran across something that I didn't know existed, and it was a it was called the Lily Mae Jackson Theodore McKeldin Archive of Civil Rights Leaders in the 30s and 40s. And it was maybe 200 interviews with people, most of them Black people that were involved in the civil rights movement then. And the thing that I remember most dramatically was realizing that the people who were being interviewed, most of them Black people, and most of them people with some standing in the Black community, they were somewhat surprised, to use that word actually, to learn that there was anybody that wanted to know what they thought. You know, the Maryland Historical Society wanted to know what a bunch of Black leaders thought about a movement, and it really was a surprise to them. But they were very expansive. They took advantage of it. They really wanted their thoughts and their ideas and the reason for their involvement to be recorded. And so that was a great thing that the Historical Society did. And you know, then or maybe even before that, it's began to be very clear to me what an outsized role Maryland, the state of Maryland, had in the civil rights movement. I mean, if you just think of the names of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and Tawny of the Dred Scott decision, the names just go on and on. Theodore McKeldin was the mayor of Baltimore, and then he was the governor of the state. And he was pretty well known in those days, in the 50s, as being somebody that some people would say, well, he's ahead of his time. He's a civil rights guy. He's a white guy, you know, and so all of that really kind of drew me into the subject.
Interesting. So Fraser, you mentioned Lily Mae Jackson, and one of the things. So whenever I talk about the civil rights movement in class or in any kind of a public setting, I always think that there are three aspects of the civil rights movement that are underappreciated. The first is just how bad things were that necessitated the movement, and we could talk about that a bit. Which, you know, it's not just segregated lunch counters and segregated water fountains, right? It's people aren't allowed to vote. People are discriminated against in every aspect of life, and then there's a tremendous amount of violence that people are either threatened with or actually experiencing if they try to buck up against this system. But the second key aspect of the civil rights movement was the role of women, the role of women as activists, and the central role played by women leaders that really is not celebrated or recognized. Some of the national names we sometimes hear, but very few of the local names. And you mentioned Lily Mae Jackson from the 1930s and 40s. Can you talk about who she was and the role she played in the movement here in Maryland?
Well, she was one of the first leaders in various things that a movement would do. One of them was called Shop Where You Can Work. And there were all shops along Pennsylvania Avenue where at the time you couldn't get a job there if you were Black, and so there was picketing was organized. Now we're right into the movement now, right? It has begun. We're starting to do things. We're trying to affect people at the pocketbook, and in fact, several days after the receipts in these stores started to fall, they began to hire people that they would never have hired before. And people that were involved in those marches included Thurgood Marshall. Marshall was, at the time, he was a beginning lawyer. He had only just started. And he would tell stories about dealing with Mrs. Jackson. It became a force in Baltimore and in the court. She would show up to argue various cases where judges were on the lookout for her. would tell their aides, "Uh-oh, there's Mrs. Jackson. Go find out what she wants." So she became a real force, and she was an important person in the development of the NAACP. Her husband was sort of light-skinned, and there was a story, which I believe is true, that she was descended from some of the white early leaders of the state of Maryland. And she talked about it a lot, and it was a source of pride, really, for her. And, you know, I think it was part of saying, we belong here. You know, we're a part of your history. You need to know this. And I'm just guessing that that's a part of what she did when she spoke.
So it's interesting. As you were just talking, I mean, that shop where you can work campaign, that's what, like the 1930s and 1940s?
Right, 30s.
Yeah. And so just to kind of thinking about on the national level, right? So the most well-known woman in the civil rights movement was Rosa Parks. And, you know, she's known for sitting on the bus. I was just thinking about her, and, you know, but when you read her story, you realize that she was doing so much more long before she sat on the bus, right? She was back in the 1940s. She's one of the leaders of the NAACP in Montgomery. She's making appeals to local government. She's investigating racial crimes, and she's doing all these things that, you know, but she's a household name because she sat on the bus that one particular day. And I think it's just interesting how central these women leaders were, and also how much they were doing long before the movement really got the national attention in the 1950s. So they're working in the 1930s and the 1940s. One other thing before, you know, to continue down that path. So the other day, Joe Biden in his speech, the first name he mentioned in his speech was Ella Baker, who was a key national figure in the civil rights movement, another woman leader. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was just reading something that Ella Baker she was being interviewed. This is back in the 1980s, and she was talking about Maryland. She mentioned, you know, what was going on in Maryland. The first head of the SCLC, the first executive director of the SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, was a preacher from Maryland. And so it was interesting just that the folks in the movement knew that Maryland was central to what was going on.
No question about it. And a lot of the ministers in Maryland were engaged in their own movement in Baltimore. And they realized, you know, for a long time, the ministers thought, well, politics is not what we do. We're just talking how to lead the kind of life that will lead you to the afterlife. But I think the movement, and probably Lily Mae Jackson, given what we know about her, was getting way out in front of them. She was the real leader, and they finally realized that they needed to get down out of the pulpit and lead, and did. And they were a real force. And they were, for example, they were recognized by people like Spiro Agnew, who, you know, the former vice president, who was the county executive in Baltimore before he became the vice president, obviously. But the ministers were on his case, and I mean, you know, and he regarded them as a force that he had to deal with, and was critical of them. And they were on the streets in 1968 during the riots. Then, you know, one of my sources says, you know, white people call them riots, and we talk about the murder of King. You know, that's the way the story comes down. But at any rate, really were very important. Gloria Richardson in Cambridge. You know, the cover of my book is called Here Lies Jim Crow. And the title comes from a law case in the 30s for men that wanted to go to the University of Maryland Law School. It was an open and shut case because under separate but equal, there was no case for the other side because there was no separate. There wasn't anything. So Donald Gaines Murray was the guy. It was in, like, I think, 1935. You know, the stories just sort of begin to line up. You know, the dean of the Howard University Law School, Marshall, did this case. They thought it was the perfect case to go after separate but equal, since obviously it was a slam dunk on that terms. But they won the case. They found a very sympathetic judge in Baltimore, and of course the state appealed the ruling in favor of Marshall. But the Court of Appeals of Maryland said that was the right decision. So what happened is there was no case to take to the Supreme Court. So it was another 15 years before we got to Brown. But it started in Maryland. And once again, you know, a bit of Maryland history that I think all of us more of us should know about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there were some other cases that got to the Supreme Court, but so they wanted to get to the Supreme Court, but they couldn't because the state court. So yeah, I guess you're right. And I've always been intrigued by those cases where they're not actually challenging separate but equal. They're saying, hey, if separate but equal is the rule of the land, the law of the land, then you should be living up to it, right? So if you're saying it's separate but equal, then give us an equal law school. But there's no other law school, so what are we going to do? You know, and so that I was always intrigued by by forcing the attempt to force the governments to live up to their own, you know, to what they're saying, to live up to their principles. And that's an intriguing aspect of those legal challenges, where initially they're just saying, look, if you say separate but equal, then it should be separate but equal. So, and if you don't have an equal school for African Americans, then something's got to change. And so I thought that's fascinating. You mentioned Gloria Richardson, which is of course one of the more intriguing people during the Civil Rights Movement in Maryland. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in Cambridge and who she was?
What was happening on the Eastern Shore involved a group of civil rights sit-in people. They were moving across the shore. They were inevitably going to get to Cambridge, where she was, and this happened a lot, actually. Young people left Maryland and went to school somewhere else. And then when they came back, they, as if they had not known any of this, it was right in their face when they came back. Oh, really? I can't do this. I can't do that. And you know, this is not going to continue. So there were people who were ready for the traveling sit-in cruise. She became head of that organization in Cambridge. She was related to somebody a black person whose name I don't remember, but he was on the council down there. And he wasn't able to do very much because, in addition to all the other outrages, when the largely black council met, he wasn't allowed to go to their dinner meeting. I mean, just think about that. So she thought that sort of humiliation needs to end. It was really pretty militant, and a lot of the black activists whose names are more familiar to us, you know, Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown and people like that, they were all very high on Gloria Richardson. And there's a picture on the cover of my book where she is demonstrating her determination because she's got her left hand pushing away guardsmen. The National Guard or the State Guard was in Cambridge for a year, and there were periodic clashes between the movement people and the Guard. And at one point, probably at the peak of its sort of a difficult moment, Brown came down there with the intent of stirring this thing to even higher level of unhappiness and resistance. And at one point he was standing on, and when he got there, Gloria actually found out that he was coming, and they weren't all that happy about the idea. They were also not real happy with King, by the way. They thought they should be doing more than King wanted to do. But anyway, so Brown comes down and he's standing on the hood of a car, and he says what he always said in those days: if this town don't come around, then burn it down. And so fires did begin. And unfortunately, they began in the black districts, and a lot of damage was done to a few black entrepreneurs, a bar owner and a restaurant owner, that were making some progress, and it hurt them very much. But Gloria was not going to move aside, and as I said, she had quite a reputation in the movement.
Yeah.
And you know, over the last 20 or 30 years, she's gotten various awards.
Yeah.
From organizations here in Maryland. I think one of them was from Washington College, because of course it's down on the shore.
The interesting thing, some of the interesting things about Cambridge, as I understand it, was that, there's a couple of things. One is that they were really pushing not just around segregation, but also around like the economic empowerment of the people in the community, and how, you know, the economic limits that had been put on folks, the discrimination, I guess, in the industries where, I guess, the crabbing and things like that. And so when I started to speak earlier, I said there were three things I always emphasized about the civil rights movement. One was how bad things were. The second was how the role of women in the movement. And then the third is the violence that surrounded the movement. We always think of the civil rights movement, nonviolence, et cetera, but there was so much violence around the movement. I mean, nonviolence was really, it was radical because it was in the face of violence. People were being killed and shot and beaten. And so that's another thing about Cambridge that you mentioned. I mean, they literally were having shootouts with some of the anti-civil rights forces, with the folks who were trying to protect segregation and the folks who were trying to end it were shooting at each other in the streets of Cambridge. And that's why the National Guard came out. And there's, I guess, Bobby Kennedy was sent out there to try to negotiate some kind of a peace, and I guess ultimately it eventually became peaceful, but it took a lot for that to happen. So Maryland was really the center of a lot of that.
Well, UN diplomats were stopped when they were trying to go to Washington, D.C. and drive through Maryland. And kinds of incidents were happening quite often. The state of Maryland was taking some minimal steps toward the various things that are available to white people, except that the way it worked in those days was if you were a county, you could opt out of state laws. It happened on the shore. So these were the kinds of things that needed to be turned around, and ultimately they were. but you know, it took time. There really had to be an amazing amount of patience, which you and I have talked about before. You know, the thing that you walk away from when you spend a little bit of time on this was the patience and the determination and the love of country. People just wanted to be part of the country, and they were willing to put up, we all know, a lot of things that were not a problem for the rest of us.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. One of the, I said earlier that one of the things I see when I look at the civil rights movement is, you know, people who are really committed to democracy and willing to sacrifice to bring it to fruition. And it's strange, but they were fighting to transform America into being what America supposedly stood for, right? So they in many ways they were more committed to the principles in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence than the folks who would come before them, and the folks who were calling them anti-American, right? So it's fascinating. The supposed radicals were more beholden to and committed to the democratic principles than the mainstream. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the sit-ins in Baltimore, the sit-in movement in Baltimore. And I mean, did you do a lot of research on that? I mean, I've heard some various folks talk about it, and it's interesting because Baltimore, there was segregation. Not everything was segregated, but a lot of things were segregated, and so it's an interesting space for that to take place.
Well, I think most of the city of Baltimore was as segregated as cities in the South. Marshall used to refer to Baltimore as up South. And, you know, he had from the work that he did with Mrs. Jackson and the dean of the law school. They didn't spend time having hurt feelings. I mean, they kept doing what they were doing, but it mattered. And the kinds of brutality that you see today, unfortunately, when people are being shot by police, that has historical roots. You know, when you look around for, if somebody were to say to you, well, why do we have to have a group? And by the way, I think there are people like this who would say, why do we have to have a group called Black Lives Matter? Why are they painting that on streets? Well, I mean, anybody that asks the question betray the lack of knowledge and understanding of the roots of all of it. Just all the kinds of, I must say, until recently, I wasn't. I mean, I've read a lot about all this, and I've written about it, but the whole idea of being constantly concerned about whether you're going to be able to protect your body. You know, the feeling that not only did you have to teach kids how to talk to police, you had to tell them that this is not something that goes away. You're always vulnerable. And you know, so this is part of growing up. You're particularly a black male. You know, and the kinds of humiliation was just in the fabric. The book begins with a story about the laboring son of Frederick, a bunch of workmen who wanted to provide for their members burial facilities. And when they started, the cemetery was in the city limits. When the city limits grew, the city fathers decided they didn't want a black cemetery, and they did something to sort of encourage them to move out. But even before they moved out, the bulldozers from City Hall along and desecrated the cemetery, as if to say, Black lives do not matter. We're going to dig up the cemetery. And, you know, they started out paying some attention to the names of the people that were buried there. And then they apparently just got tired of it and quit. And they were able to identify maybe half of the 2,000 or so bodies that were there. But you know, this is the kind of thing that sometimes it's just taken for granted. And you know, I mean, to bring it even closer to home right now, if you look at the neighborhood where Freddie Gray lived and grew up, the incidence of chronic disease there is so high that life expectancy is 5 to 10 years lower than if you lived in a neighborhood maybe 2 to 3 miles away from Stanton, Winchester, where he lived. So this is why people talk about systemic racism and a system that needs to be really fundamentally changed, you know, to deal with issues like that. Something like Santana Winchester, I don't think, would have ever happened in Charles Village.
Yeah.
To name another Baltimore neighborhood.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say all that. So one of the things we can see maybe historically we don't see in the present. Maybe it's easier to see in history that dynamic that you just mentioned, which is just the devaluing of Black lives, the devaluing of Black communities, whether it's, you know, just tearing up a cemetery or just marginalizing, you know, a group of people. When you go back and you look at the use of the law and the use of government to keep people on the fringes of the society, it's mind blowing because it's so inconsistent with who we tell ourselves we are as a country, right? It's so inconsistent. I mean, everyone's taught, you know, everyone's equal, or you know, maybe there are some exceptions where some bad things have happened occasionally. But when you look at the history, you see that it wasn't like an anomaly. It wasn't like an occasional, you know, bad policy here or a segregated lunch counter there. It was the totality of the system that says, you know, some people's lives don't matter as much as other people's, and that's it. You know, so it's that the segregation was just more of a reflection of that overall sentiment rather than the full manifestation of the problem. And I think that's kind of that's the challenge, I guess, to really understand. And sometimes I get really critical of the way we think about the history of racism, the way we think about the civil rights movement as just being about these little things, these little simple things of integrating water fountains, but not really getting at the root of those are all just policies and manifestations of something much deeper, which is just not valuing people, right? Not seeing them as fully human. And that seems to have persisted in different ways. And that's, I guess, is the challenge that we're dealing with now. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, you know, when you see a policeman kneeling on somebody's neck and making it impossible for them to breathe and then not possible to keep breathing and living, I think the lesson there is pretty clear. I don't, you know, and it's still there, and you know, we made a lot of progress in our country. We really have, and I think people like John Lewis, who I think ought to be everybody's hero at this point, and particularly after we've seen so much of the life he led. It, you know, but it continues, and Lewis's life was remarkable to me, and you know, all the way to the very end.
Yeah.
You know, he gets out of his hospital bed to go down there and stand on that street for Black Lives Matter. So it's still there, but it you know, the determination is still there, and it's going to, I think it's going to still be needed, even though, you know, people say, well, we've come to an inflection point here. In other words, there's going to be really fundamental systemic change. It's not going to happen unless Black Lives Matter and other groups are going to have to continue. That's just our history. I don't think there's any denying it, really.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, are we ready for some questions from the audience? Jenna, do we have any questions?
We do. Let me just read you a few of them because they are very pertinent to some of your conversations. The first question we have is, how did Blacks fare in court cases related to the violence surrounding the movement, the civil rights movement?
It's a good question. Fraser, did you?
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry. I didn't hear the question.
It was, how did Blacks fare in the court cases related to the violence surrounding the movement? As I understand it, there were very few court cases that were brought, at least against folks who had committed violence against civil rights activists. Especially during the time period, very few, if any, folks were prosecuted for killing or beating civil rights activists. In decades later, a few people were ultimately prosecuted, but for the most part, the brutalizers, you know, got off scot-free. And oftentimes those brutalizers were law enforcement themselves. I mean, we just mentioned John Lewis, you know, the famous incident, the Selma March, Bloody Sunday, where those marchers were beaten by, you know, state troopers and local law enforcement and other folks who had been deputized for that purpose. So there are lots. In fact, John Lewis was beaten on multiple occasions by law enforcement or folks acting with the permission of law enforcement. And so most of the time, people who were, you know, in the movement were beaten or killed by folks who weren't prosecuted and weren't brought to justice.
Or if they were found not guilty.
Yeah.
It often happened. What, you know, the Schwerner and Goodman and I've forgotten the third member of the group.
Cheney.
I mean, people were tried for that. And you know, if you lived through any of that, you remember pictures of the accused killers in the courtroom.
Yeah.
But, you know, no way that anybody's going. We know we're not going to be found guilty of any of that. So,
yeah. It goes back to even the Emmett Till case, where, you know, the husband and who had, you know, beaten and killed Emmett Till. You know, they told their story afterwards because they were found not guilty. You know, so we know exactly what happened in that case of that child being lynched. Yeah.
you know, if there is such a thing as an inflection point here, and we have to hope there is, my guess is that there have been points like that individually. Lewis told the story of one of the state policemen that beat him, came to see him once when he was elected, who came and met him in Lewis's office to apologize. And guess what Lewis did?
What?
He hugged him. He embraced him. Well, I mean, there's the story all over again, you know? What did the people in Charleston do? Church members there.
Yeah.
Well, their immediate idea was to forgive the killer. So, you know, you would think that we would have gotten to a point when those examples would have been inflection points all by themselves. And once again, I mean, I think people weren't standing around waiting for that to happen. They just kept at it, and they are now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do we have another question?
We do. We have another one that goes along with some of the violence and the stories you were just telling. So this one, this question is asking if you can name any of the key racists that were leading some of the opposing groups at the time, opposing organizations, and were there books or reports during that time period that fed this type of mindset?
Well, I'm sorry. Once again, I can't hear. I couldn't hear all of it.
So she asked, were there books or I guess literature that was feeding the mindset of the racists? And I guess the questioner wanted to know whether like leading racists who kind of promoted these ideas that maybe were at the forefront of these movements. I would say actually not. Well, there were a lot. There were. I don't think this wasn't a movement where this wasn't a deviation from traditional American ideas, right? This is what a lot of people in the United States thought and promoted. And so the leading racists or the leading defenders of segregation were the governors of most of these states, right? They were the elected, they were the Congress people, they were the senators. So these are people who espoused these ideas, and they weren't shaping the thoughts of others. They were elected to represent those ideas. So it wasn't like there was a Hitler who emerged and persuaded everyone that segregation was good. No, the elected officials were elected because they promoted the ideas that the masses wanted, and the masses wanted segregation. I think that we have to appreciate the extent to which these ideas were widespread and persistent across the United States, not just in the South, but across the country, especially in the South. It was open in the South, but it wasn't just the Deep South. I mean, if you think about Brown versus Board of Education, the famous court case, that's in Kansas, right? That's Kansas. That's against segregated schools in Kansas. And some of the greatest racial crimes occurred in the North, right? There were lynchings in the North. There were massacres in the North, in Missouri, in Illinois. So I think we have to appreciate that these ideas weren't like put upon, they weren't exceptional, they weren't anomalous, they were it was the exceptional person who went against it. At least that's my reading of the history. That's why it was so hard to change, right? It wasn't easy to change. That's why there was resistance. You would think if someone said, "Hey, you know what? We're being discriminated against," that the masses would say, "Oh, wow, that's bad. Change it." No, it wasn't. It took a mass movement to change, and folks had to fight against local government and state governments, not just a few random racists, not just a few Klansmen. I think we need to appreciate that the extent of the problem, the extent of the enormity of the forces that were defending segregation and discrimination, to appreciate, what they accomplished.
Donn, I completely agree with you. I think it's unavoidable, and unfortunately, I don't think that way of behaving and thinking is not dead.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I mean, why would it be there in the police? And it seems to be sort of in the training or something. I mean, white people that are accused of crimes don't get shot down in the street. I mean, really, does that happen? I don't see it.
Doesn't happen with
There's some reason why that goes on, and also people have traced that kind of behavior, back to the enforcers of the Fugitive Slave Act and things like that. I mean, it's in the soil.
Yeah, I mean, it's enormous, right? And if I think, again, one of my criticisms of the way we teach history and we talk about history is we make it seem a lot lighter than it was. We make the problem a lot lighter than it was, right? The reality of if you appreciate that masses of people had these ideas, or at least accepted that this is a part of life, and it's ingrained in every aspect of the society, then you wouldn't expect it to change just by the passing of a couple of laws, right? And then you'd know that it takes like a revolution of thought. We've made a lot of progress, but it hasn't been completely eradicated. That dehumanization, that viewing some people as less than, has not been eradicated. And I think that's what's at the root of a lot of what we see today, is that folks just don't view others as fully human, right? They're not worried about that life. They don't value that life as much, right? And that's I don't know how you can how you change that in people's, in their thinking, but I think that's part of what's going on.
It's an argument that spans the history of the country and the history of the movement. You would hear people say, and you still do, I'm sure, you can't change people's hearts. You can't, passing a law doesn't get you where you need to be. Well, no, it doesn't, but you have to start there. You can't have a society where you're permitting that kind of behavior. We live in a community, or we hope we do, and if there are things that get in the way of that, they need to be somehow, people has to be convinced that that's inimical to our future. We're not going to have a future if we don't figure out how to deal with some of these things, and we're not going to have a happy, peaceful one if we don't.
Yeah, Martin Luther King said he would comment on that when people would say that. He said, a law is not going to change someone's heart, but it can change their behavior, right? And I think that he understood that eventually you can change the heart, but in the short term, you have to change their behavior, So you can't, the law's not going to make the racist stop hating me, but it can make him stop, beating me, and I think that's where oftentimes the discussion is always around trying to persuade people to think differently. But, you need laws to get them to act differently until they think differently.
Well, that was, I think, one of the sort of misunderstandings of Brown. Mm-hmm. It really wasn't about, if you listen to Thurgood Marshall, and we should, it wasn't about integration. It was about equal access to what it would take to educate kids. When they started to argue, Maryland was arguing against him, and again the Howard Dean. They were talking about the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Mm-hmm. Marshall and Houston, that's his name, realized that there was nothing down there, except black kids that couldn't go to the University of Maryland in College Park. So they had to go there. Well, that wasn't equal either. There was no separate but equal there either. I mean, there was no law school at all. But if you wanted, if you listen for just a moment to what the state of Maryland said, that didn't hold up either, because there was, the chem labs, for the chemistry labs, they didn't have any facilities there. They didn't have any people on the faculty that could teach what kids needed to learn. So there, it was root and branch.
Yeah.
Donn and Fraser, I hate to cut you off. I know you're getting into some really great content, but I know you have one more area you wanted to touch on with Gwynn Oak and the amusement park there. I didn't know, we have about 10 minutes left before Q&A, if you could share some thoughts on that specific event.
Well, it's a famous case, in part because the focus of it was a merry-go-round. I think everybody can relate to kids and merry-go-round. And I think my memory on this is not as clear as it should be, but I remember there were black kids and white kids on the merry-go-round I think it was happened on the day of the March on Washington.
Yeah. So
John Lewis made his famous speech.
Yeah, so the Gwynn Oak Amusement Park, became like the target of major protests for integration, and it actually got a lot of national attention. I think I recall reading that one of I think it was Mickey Schwerner had come down and participated in some of those protests. Schwerner was one of the civil rights activists who would be killed in Mississippi sometime later. So it was a movement that was getting a lot of attention in terms of trying to integrate this amusement park. And it actually was a big deal in Maryland, got national attention. And it was the day they actually finally succeeded in terms of integrating Gwynn Oak Park on the same day as the March on Washington, August 28th. Actually, not, on 1963. And so there's this famous picture of the first little girl on the carousel with white kids. So that was a big deal, and that's also the story, I think, in the movie Hairspray. I think that was kind of sort of loosely based on the protests around the integration of Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. So then another case of Maryland being at the center of the movement.
Right, exactly.
Jenna, do we have any other questions?
We do. So, and I actually know just, you both taught me a little bit about the Gwynn Oak Amusement Park. I was doing some research on it, and that carousel is actually on the National Mall now. So if anyone wants to visit it, they can go there, and I think you can still ride it, which is pretty neat. So this is a little bit longer question. It starts with a story, and I'm going to read it all for context. An African-American friend of mine who is 97 years old talks about riding in a car from Baltimore to Western Maryland with white friends. She could not go into restaurants along the way, and so she brought her lunch in a shoebox, a common practice for African-Americans at the time. Would you please talk about the fight for equal access to public accommodations in Maryland?
Well, I just mentioned a little bit about the law that they passed that begin to deal with some of those discriminatory practices, and the Eastern Shore decided to take itself out of that law, and so there needed to be more pressure to bring the shore back into the state of Maryland. But I mean, if you were a black family and you were going to go somewhere, if you were going on a trip, you knew that you were going to, I think the phrase was something like you were going to drive straight through. Mm-hmm. You knew that there was not going to be a place to stop, even to eat, unless you wanted to go around the back of the building. Mm-hmm. And we'll serve you, but you can't come in here. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't very different from the South. I mean, in fact, I think it was exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And you had mentioned earlier in passing that dynamic where you would have African or other diplomats leaving New York City at the United Nations, traveling south to go to meetings in Washington, D.C., and experiencing that, and how that was a major embarrassment to the United States and to the federal government, that these diplomats had to be subject. I mean, it should be embarrassing enough that your own citizens have to deal with it, but the idea of that, right, where you're just trying to drive from New York to D.C., and you either are denied service or you're forced to go in the back. The humiliation and the dehumanization entailed in that. It's in the scope of all the injuries people were experiencing back then. It may not have been the biggest, but it was constant, right? It's a constant.
Well, and you mentioned before Bobby Kennedy and his involvement in all of this, mm-hmm. and it had an impact on the United States position in the United Nations. And it had to do with votes that were taken, and it was not a slam dunk for the U.S. to maintain whatever position it was that they had then. They were worried, Kennedy was worried that we might offend somebody from a country whose vote we needed.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And so you have to straighten that out over there. And it was, I think it was probably during the time when, when the shore decided it wasn't going to live with whatever law had just been passed about open accommodations. So it even had some almost international implications, what was going on there.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, there's always, and then there's the United States is in the midst of the Cold War, and what we're saying, U.S. stands for democracy and freedom and equality, and the communists are saying, you know what, but look how you treat, the American Negro. And then you'd see, I remember there are these pictures I sometimes show in class where there are these protesters, these folks protesting against integration. They hold up these signs that say race mixing is communism, right? And I always tell my students, you know what, the communists love that sign because they say, yeah, race mixing is communism. And so it's in a global context. The United States looks very hypocritical, right? If you're claiming to be the defender of democracy and you don't even have democracy, full democracy for your own citizens, and visitors who come to the country can see it, so that all of that kind of plays into some of the pressure that does eventually emerge. But the driving factor that brings change are the people on the ground who actually push for it. So it was very, very difficult.
Yeah, I think at that meeting at Kennedy's office, the people from Cambridge, the council members, and I think Gloria was there as well. They were there describing what was going on, and there was some tacit agreement by these council guys that they would relent and stop enforcing whatever bad laws there were. And I talked to one of the members of the council in those days. Who was much more liberal than some of his colleagues. And they're driving back together to Cambridge after the meeting with Kennedy, and they're basically saying to each other, "What did we just decide? Did we really decide that we were going to stop doing what we've been doing?" And this guy said, "Yeah, that's what we did. We decided that." I guess I was sort of really taken in by Bobby. He was a pretty charming guy.
Yeah.
So, that's really where it kind of comes down to that level. And that's why organizing and Gloria Richardson and people, they were so incredibly important in all of this.
Yeah.
So I know we're coming to the end of our conversation. We are on a little bit of a tighter time crunch today because Dr. Worgs has a class at 2:00. So I want to make sure we are conscious of how much time he has. But there is a question here that says, history is just very telling. Do you have any recommendations for books to read? Fraser, I'm sure you have one specific to share.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody should read my book. It's called Here Lies Jim Crow, Civil Rights in Maryland. And it's really kind of an overview of what's happened here from the cemetery in Frederick to the laws on the shore and dealing with trying to take care of the needs of the working man in Frederick and the trammeling of that. And there we go. Yeah. Lovely. So anyway, you see Gloria there pushing the people out of the way.
Yeah, I love
That's
that.
why she got a lot of props from her.
Yeah, I love that picture. I would recommend, I would recommend two books that I really like. One is John Lewis's autobiography. I think it is Walking with the Wind, I think is the title. But
Yes.
yeah, that one I think that's a really insightful book. And then there's a biography of Rosa Parks that I really like. It's called The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. The author is Theo Harris is a last name, historian. Those are two books that I really think are really insightful and I really enjoyed.
Well, I really agree with you about Walking with the Wind. There's so much to learn in that, and you can't walk away from it without having incredible respect for John Lewis.
Yeah.
Before, but boy, the life he lived.
Yes.
Well, Donn and Fraser, I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. We had quite a few questions come in that we just didn't have time to answer. I think we could have probably continued this discussion for many more hours. But I thank everyone who joined us today. Some of the questions that came in are actually relating to current times. So I'd like you all to join us on Wednesday, September 23rd at noon for part 2 of this discussion, where Donn and Fraser are going to lead us through conversations on contemporary civil rights movements, including Freddie Gray and Black Lives Matter. This Friday, the TU Alumni Association and the Towson Black Alumni Alliance are partnering to host a virtual DJ happy hour in recognition of Black Philanthropy Month, with the goal of elevating and empowering Black lives here at TU and around the country. We invite every member of the TU community to join us in supporting the scholarships, programs, and funds that ensure Black students, faculty, and staff succeed at TU. You can register and learn more about both of these events at alumni.towson.edu/events. The links are on the DJ Happy Hour event to specific funds you can donate to support our causes here at Towson University. I'd like to thank the TU Retired Faculty Association and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for the support of this discussion. Of course, Donn and Fraser, thank you again. We couldn't have done it without you. Make sure you follow the TU Alumni Association on our social media channels and on Tiger Connect, our alumni community. These details are posted in the chat window and also in front of you right now. Thank you, and we hope to see you all again in September.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.